Okay, this is great. I guess we're live. I don't know. Just give me a couple of seconds to check on this. Okay, good. There's a 30-second delay on liberty.me. That's fine. Good. Okay, I guess I'm seeing some chatters. It's hard to tell from this. This is our new system of using Google Hangouts for live presentations, which I actually far prefer. So if you can hear me okay, just type in the window. That's fine. Thank you, Emily. Emily's commenting on my jacket. So yeah, well, it is what it is. So I sometimes wear it. You know, I mean, this is not a jacket that I would wear to the office, but it is Sunday, after all. So that's a day for knocking around and being a little bit silly. So I threw it on because it's comfortable and kind of crazy. So there you go. Used to be, you know, probably in the 1920s, very fashionable, you know, sort of colonial madras patchwork wear. Now, of course, you hardly see it at all anymore because it's for obvious reasons. It's totally absurd. So, but it is what it is. So thank you. Well, listen, I'm so glad to be with you tonight. We're going to be discussing Isabel Paterson's amazing book, which I don't think many people have read. In fact, I don't think people are reading it at all. It emerges every once in a while in the course of conversation. People talk about her chapter, The Humanitarian with the Guillotine, which is chapter 20, which I'm going to focus on tonight. I think it is the best chapter, but I don't want to neglect the rest of the book. We have to remember something about this book, and I just to give a little bit of background about Isabel Paterson and the book in general. This book, The God and the Machine, came out in 1943. A little bit strange. It came out the same year as The Fountainhead and Rose Wilder Lane's book, The Discovery of Freedom, and this book. So 3 women the same year published, you know, very mighty tributes to human liberty at the same time, and they all reviewed each other's books favorably. Apparently, Paterson didn't really like Lane and didn't really review her book favorably. You know, we should never forget that in the course of intellectual history, personal disputes have a lot to do with what people say. It's very common that somebody would be deeply influenced by somebody else and yet never cite them or mention their names in public. I mean, I had this happen to me, actually. It's very interesting. I've had good friends who I, you know, sort of mentored to maturity, you know, and then moved on to a different career, and for whatever kind of political reasons are unwilling to acknowledge my existence. Actually, it's pretty weird and kind of freaky. I don't like to be that way. I like to talk about, you know, I like to believe that I'm fair and that sort of thing. But you know, whatever. I mean, in the course of intellectual history, it's very common for mentors and proteges to never mention each other's existence, and that was true with Paterson vis-a-vis Rose Wilder Lane. Lane loved this book and praised it and reviewed it favorably. Ayn Rand praised this book, reviewed it very favorably. In fact, called it, the best book on human liberty in many decades, maybe ever, even praising it above her own work. And Albert J. Nock highlighted this book as being, an important and mighty treatise. But Paterson herself never acknowledged Lane's existence, although she would quite frequently write about Ayn Rand. So, these kind of relationships are complicated. We should never forget this one in the course of trying to discover intellectual history. Personal relationships matter as much as the ideas. You have to know something about the characters and something about the biographies to fully understand this. But I think this is a mistake that intellectual historians often make, is if such and such thinker is not citing somebody else, you figure, well, there's no influence there. It's just ridiculously untrue. For example, just to mention one example, I was very good friends with Murray Rothbard in the 10 years before his death. And he always praised Ayn Rand, as a great thinker and a great figure in history. But you wouldn't quite know that from his writings, because he had something like a very long relationship with the collective, into Rand's collective, entered into the collective, left, re-entered it, left again. He was hugely influenced by Ayn Rand. In many ways, I would say that Rothbard is predominantly a student of Rand's, but you would not know that by reading his works, because the personal, because the complications of the personal relationship were so intense. His best friend, George Reisman, and he had a dispute over over the Rand mess. And Murray went one way, Reisman went the other way. They never spoke again in the course of their lives. Things like this happen. Personal relationships end up being hugely important. And for Isabel Paterson, her relationship with Rand was itself gigantically important in her life. And Rand's, in turn, owes a great debt to Isabel Paterson. How this allocates itself out, I'm not entirely sure. Probably at this point last year, I would have thought that Rand's ideas about humanitarianism and the ethic of egoism had come from Paterson, because in the chapter I'm going to read to you, Paterson sounds a lot like Rand. There's some differences, but the language is so similar, and that to the language you read like in Atlas Shrugged. But now that I've read a little more Rand and been embedded a little bit, like her 1936 book Anthem, or even her earlier work, her play January 16th, I think it's called, you see that same sort of ethic of egoism in Rand's work long before you read about it in Isabel Paterson. So who influenced who, I don't know. In some ways, I've kind of come to the conclusion that these questions are a little bit silly, and in the sense that sometimes people assume that ideas are like products traded from one to the other. So I have this, phone, I give it to you, you own it. You give me, a box of cookies, I own that. They both retain their objective qualities. And we can decide and trace out the pattern of exchange. But when it comes to ideas, things are really different. I can pass on an idea to you as I am right now. You can receive it in a different form than I intended to deliver it. And why is that? It's because ideas have a certain malleability to them. They're changed by the very reception of them. If you give me a box of cookies, there's nothing that changes about that good from the passing of your hands to my hands. But if you give me an idea, that idea might take one shape in your brain, and then it enters into my brain, and it takes on a completely different shape. And if I give back, and that newly received idea gives rise to a new idea to me, and I give it back to you, you're going to receive it, in a different way than it existed in my head. So it's not like the exchange of physical property. It's something different. And that's because of the peculiar characteristic of ideas. They're infinitely malleable. So in a really good conversation, what should happen is that they're always dynamically malleable. So you give me an idea, it gives rise to an idea that I have. I test it out on you. You receive it in a different form in which I had it. That gives you an idea. You give it back to me. It changes back in my mind. I give it back to you. And each time we do this, it's giving rise to ever newer ideas. And at some point in the course of a really healthy and wonderful conversation, the ideas we hold that we come away with are completely different from anything we entered into the conversation with holding. So ideas become themselves creative. They make new things out of raw material. So it would be like as if you gave me some dough and I turned it into some bread, you know, and I gave you the bread and you converted it into you know, pasta. And then you gave me the pasta and I converted it into lasagna and so on, you know. And then at the end, you have a completely different table of goods than you brought to it. So this is more or less, I think, what happened with Rand and Paterson. They had this kind of friendship in which they, you know, and Rand was famous for staying up all night in the course of intellectual conversations, you know, obviously a very intense woman, and so was Isabel Paterson, who, by the way, was a very famous writer, literary critic, acerbic and brilliant in her time, born in 1886 and died in 1961, achieved the height of fame, really, in New York literary circles for her astonishing reviews and writings, and she was absolutely brilliant. This is not a woman who lived a political existence. She was mostly in literary circles. This one book is the exception. But she and Rand became very fast friends in the course of Rand's writing of the Fountainhead. And they would have these long nights where they would stay up all night. But of course, I mean, it's a little peculiar because Rand had this funny view of intellectual property, which, if you know my own work, I look down very heavily on intellectual property. I mean, the very premise of IP is that ideas operate very much like physical goods, so that you can, you know, hold them and contain them and identify them and put a title on them. So if I have an idea for these glasses, you know, these glasses, I can say, these are my glasses. If you take them from me, you're guilty of theft, and so on. So IP treats ideas as if they're just like any normal piece of property, which they aren't, because ideas are infinitely reproducible, they're malleable, they're portable, they're weightless. There's all these features of ideas that make them radically different from property. And you can't commodify ideas in that way. You can't title them and treat them as if they're just regular property. It's going to lead to catastrophic results. But nonetheless, both Rand and Paterson, I think, to some extent, they were both believers in intellectual property. It was a generational thing. And libertarians in the 1940s tended to accept this. Without exception, I think. Maybe Hayek is the one exception. That at this point he started to distrust the idea of intellectual property. But most everybody else believed in it. So these weird things would happen between Rand and Paterson. They would get together and have a great evening of exchange and conversation and create new thoughts, and each feeding off each other and giving each other new ideas, and those would convert to new ideas, and you know, and so on. It would last all night long. And then Rand would go home, and the next day they would call each other on the phone and review what they had discussed. And you know, like great conversations, you often come away with the sense that you discovered something brand new. And Rand would raise this and say, well, you know, last night we talked about such and such subject. I hope you agree, Isabel, that that was my idea. And then Isabel would say, well, I'm not so sure, because I'm pretty certain I had that idea first. And Rand would say, no, I pretty much, when I came to your house, I held that idea in my head. I mean, if you're claiming credit for it, you're actually taking it from me. And then Isabel would say, that's very strange you would say that, because because I'm almost certain I've believed that very thing since the 1930s, so I had it probably long before you did. And so on. It went with these two. And they came to blows over their friendship, over whose idea belonged to whom. And they ended their friendship over this. McElroy's outstanding introduction to this book says the source of their breakup was that Isabel Paterson was a believer in God, which is true, a celebrator of Christianity, which is true, and Rand was not. Rand thought Christianity was in many ways the root of all evil. Not all evil, but was symptomatic of what she thought was the great evil in the world. So they disagreed profoundly on this, and that's what broke up their friendship. That might have been part of it, but reading Rand's more recent biographers, I think that this explanation that they broke up over whose ideas belonged to whom is actually a more viable story. I mean, honestly, my friends, I don't see how any believer in intellectual property can be friends with anybody and have exchanges of ideas, because what's the purpose of getting together with people and hanging out? Is it just to tell them what you think, or to be a receiver to be a willing listener to what they think? I mean, neither sounds very satisfying. I mean, you don't need to be there to hear what anybody else thinks if you're not going to do anything with it. And you don't need anybody there listening to what you think if you resent the fact they're going to use your ideas. I mean, you're better off staying in complete isolation. The whole purpose of a conversation is to share and remix and discover new things together. So there's a natural sort of, I would say, almost a communism of ideas that's inherent in every conversation you've ever had. You're naturally sharing. And it's beyond sharing. You're contributing to an economy of accumulation in hopes that it's going to lead to a setting of production. And obviously that production belongs to both of you. There's nothing wrong with that. That's good. So anyway, just a tip for friendship that I found very important in maintaining friendships, especially with intellectuals. Consider yourself a giver and a taker. And say at the very outset, and I've done this with people, anything I say, please take it, please use it. Don't feel the need to attribute it to me. If I have a really a good idea that you like, use it. I'll be flattered. Run with it. Make $1 million. That's great. There's more where that came from. And similarly, say to the person you're talking to, your insights are profound. It's very possible that you're going to influence me profoundly, and that when you read my work in a week from now, 2 weeks from now, a year from now, you will bump into things that I will write that you prompted me to think. And I can't promise that I'll cite you at every occasion. And if you establish that kind of friendship, it can be very fruitful. You can call it an economy of stealing, if you want to. But it's a wonderful way to go about establishing the basis of a friendship. So there's not that sense of fear of stealing from each other. So just that's a tip for getting along with other people. And actually, when that happens, you'll find that you can develop very beautiful friendships if a person believes that he or she can just take from you, and you can take from him or her. It's a really nice basis on which to form really lovely conversations and lasting friendships. Whereas if you believe that you have to divide up ideas and title them and commodify them and attribute them later and ask for permission to use them, I mean, that's not a basis for a friendship. So anyway, that's just kind of a tip. I'm always, sort of saddened when I hear about these splits. Isabel and Rand were very good friends. They were wonderful partners. And then suddenly the whole thing blows up, I always consider that to be a terrible tragedy, because when you lose an intellectual friend, you're losing the most valuable thing in the world, which is the influence of a mind you respect and appreciate. So we should do everything within our power to keep that from happening. It always makes me so sad when I read about these stories of intellectual splits, because it makes you wonder how the world might have been different. I mean, how different would Rand have been if she continued to be Isabel Paterson's friend? How different would have Isabel Paterson been if she continued to be Rand's friend, or if Lane and Paterson had been able to maintain their friendships? You know, what the world would have looked like. I mean, why do we so willingly cut off the influence of others? You know, why do we do this? I mean, I know why we do it. Personal jealousies, pride. There's lots of circumstances, but all I'm saying is that it's always very regrettable and sad. We shouldn't seek to do this. I'm always very sad about the fact that George Reisman and Murray, lost their friendship, and Murray lost the friendship of many people in the course of his life. And I'm always saddened when I read about these stories. I just don't think there's ever a really good reason for it. Sometimes it's unavoidable. It's going to happen, but I don't think it's anything we should seek out. It's nothing we should celebrate, or much less cause to happen. And there's some people out there who somehow think that it's good to have conflict between people because it draws attention. I think that's a very dangerous attitude. There's the guy who was, a couple of years ago, who's denouncing me very very aggressively online and persistently, and posting, terrible things about me and stuff. And I wrote him and I said, "Hey, buddy, could you kind of cool this? I mean, this is a little intense, and I don't feel the need to respond to you, but I'm not sure why you're doing this." And he was very nice. He wrote me back. He said, "No, you have to understand, Jeffrey, that this kind of conflict, it's actually a very good thing. It's good for me because I get attention because I'm attacking you. And if you attack me back, that'd be great, because then you'll give me attention, and then I'll attack you back, and then that will give you attention. And then that way we can both benefit." And I remember reading this and thinking, all right, this doesn't work for me. This is this is theater. And it's a very nihilistic attitude. And it's also, I would say, unlibertarian, because as libertarians, our fundamental conviction is that people can learn to cooperate and get along through cooperation, that we both benefit from each other, not through conflict, but by contributing in a civil way to each other's lives. So to posit the idea that we both benefit from conflicts strikes me like it gets too close to a kind of a Marxist theory of social engagement, and I'm troubled by that. I think it's in the long run very destructive. We should seek, I think, to maintain our friendships and not benefit at the expense of other people. Like, the beautiful thing about the free market is that we all win, and gain from trade, and it leads to civility and friendships and ever extending networks of mutual beneficence and benevolence. I mean, to me, that's what's really beautiful about capitalism, that it leads to a sort of culture of getting along, like people who otherwise would have never have a reason to deal with each other or talk to each other, have a mutual interest in valuing each other, finding value in each other. And that makes life worth living. Conflict depreciates life. It sucks, basically. I don't see any benefit to it whatsoever, So anyway, that's the great lesson I learned from the relationship of Isabel Paterson and Ayn Rand. That is always regrettable. As I say, sometimes you can't help it. It's going to happen. But I don't think it's anything we should ever seek out. And seeking reconciliation with our friends and neighbors is, I think, very important for human progress, actually. So anyway, I would like to use a few minutes now to read from my favorite chapter of this book. Again, Isabel Paterson was not very political. She was mainly interested in modernist literature. She was a pretty successful novelist, but a very successful critic, acerbic, witty, devastating, extremely intelligent, despite having had very little formal education. She was just a genius and a reminder. I mean, I can't, you read through this book and it's just astonishing, the amount of historical references and philosophical understanding. I mean, it's just proof that people who, with very high IQs and a great deal of curiosity, can achieve amazing things. In fact, it's kind of remarkable to think about the number of people in the libertarian world in that era who made such mighty contributions without any kind of serious formal education. I mean, I think of people like Rosewater Lane, Ayn Rand, Isabel Paterson. None of them were academics. None of them had higher education. Rand was probably the most educated of anybody. She went to college for a little while, and that was about it. Henry Hazlitt is another genius who became a big shot in New York literary circles, and actually the literary editor of The Nation, and the successor to H.L. Mencken. And speaking of geniuses without high levels of education, look at H.L. Mencken, probably one of the great geniuses of the 20th century, successor to Mark Twain, and probably greater, and probably the greatest writer in the English language. Was never a professor, never had any kind of formal higher level of education. It's important for you to think about, especially now that we're living through what I think is the slow collapse of the education bubble. Education levels have nothing to do with intelligence, which if you've ever been to college, because there's a lot of dopey professors out there. Anyway, so Isabel Paterson, Ayn Rand, Rosewater Lane, these kinds of people made a huge mark in history. She was not an anarchist, but close to it. But it's as close as that generation was sort of permitted themselves to go. I mean, just bumping up right up against the edge of it. Her case against anarchism is actually in a whole chapter, and I won't discuss that tonight. I may have to blow my nose here. Hold on one second. But an opponent of war, a proponent of the gold standard, a champion of free markets, an opponent of U.S. entry into World War II, and so the same fate befell her as befell that whole generation of people that hated the New Deal and also hated the entry into World War II. History turned against them, so she was not well regarded. After the war, she wrote for Bill Buckley's National Review for a while, until her untimely death in 1961. So she was kind of considered a major intellectual of the right in that period. But these days, when I brought this book back into print, I feel like I was bringing back to print a kind of lost classic, and I'm really sad about that in some ways. I think she should be better known and more well read. So the chapter I'd like to discuss in my remaining time is chapter 20, The Humanitarian with a Guillotine. And what she's discussing here are the good intentions that are widely seen as upholding the most egregious policies. Her theory is that outright criminality, which she regards the state as outright criminal, alone is not enough to sustain the state, that they have to have some other rationale for why they're doing things. And humanitarianism, the idea that they're actually doing good for the world, is the main one, and that this has to persuade the majority of citizens, or people would not be willing to go along with these activities. So her chapter is called The Humanitarian with a Guillotine, and I think it's extremely profound, and she writes in a very compelling way. So I'd just kind of like to read it to you. I would say that the humanitarian justification for statism was very, very common in the 1930s and the 1940s and the 1920s. It certainly was the justification behind communism and the rise of the American total state in the progressive era. Today, in the 21st century, yes, that justification is still around, but you see many other justifications. In addition to this idea that we're promoting the public good, you have an ethos of sacrifice that comes with every new regulatory imposition. Science is another one. Religious holiness and salvation is another one. There's many, many rationales for state policy, but the one she hammers home here is this idea of doing good for the greatest number is the basis for tyranny, and Paterson, just like Rand, turns this into a kind of a general theory. Now, what Paterson does not do, and you'll be interested if you've ever read the work of Rand, you see that Rand goes much further. I mean, Rand turned the opposite of this kind of collectivist humanitarianism into a kind of personal philosophy. Like, she thought the only way to combat collectivism was through an ethic of egoism, that was the ultimate and finally the only way to combat human evil in the world. Paterson does not go that far, so you can see that Rand takes her argument much further. As to whose argument belongs to whom, it's really difficult to say. I would have to admit, though, that in my study of Rand's own work, I think it's pretty obvious that Rand held these views from like the 1920s, really, from the time she was in college in Russia, where she first mapped out the plot of Anthem. I mean, it was pretty clear that ethical egoism is part of Rand's whole life philosophy and did not come from Isabel Paterson. As I say, last year I think I claimed otherwise, and I think I was wrong about that. It seems to me that they both borrowed from each other. But let me, again, I don't know who took from whom, but I mean, the parallels are very close. I must say I'm very drawn to Isabel Paterson's presentation, because Paterson doesn't take that extra step in embracing, the foil to collectivist humanitarianism, and instead just stays with a kind of just a pure pro-reason philosophy. Okay, let me. I'm going to read this to you because I think it's just so good, and I hope the sound is right on this. Okay. So, I'm trying to find the right place for this book here. So I'm reading from my iPad. It's amazing, right? Okay. Chapter 20. Most of the harm in the world is done by good people, and not by accident, lapse, or omission. It is the result of their deliberate actions, long persevered in, which they hold to be motivated by high ideals towards virtuous ends. This is demonstrably true, nor could it be otherwise. The percentage of positively malignant, vicious, or depraved persons is necessarily small, for no species could survive if its members were habitually and consciously bent on injuring one another. Destruction is so easy that even a minority of persistently evil intent could shortly exterminate the unsuspecting majority of well-disposed persons. Murder, theft, rapine, destruction are easily within the power of every individual at any time. If it is presumed that they are restrained only by fear or force, what is it they fear, or who would turn the force against them if all men were of like mind? Certainly if the harm done by willful criminals were to be computed, the number of murders, the extent of damage and loss would be found negligible in the sum total of death and devastation wrought upon human beings by their kind. Therefore, it is obvious that in periods when millions are slaughtered, when torture is practiced, starvation enforced, oppression made a policy, as at present all over the world in 1943, and as it has often been in the past, it must be at the behest of very many good people, and even by their direct action for what they consider a worthy object. When they are not the immediate executants, they are on record as giving approval, elaborating justifications, or else cloaking facts with silence and concatenating discussion. I'm sorry about my mispronunciation there. Obviously, this could not occur without cause or reason, and it must be understood in the above passage that by good people we mean good people, persons who would not of their own conscience intend to act to hurt their fellow men, nor procure such acts, either wantonly or for personal benefit to themselves. Good people wish well to their fellow men, and wish to guide their own actions accordingly. Further, we do not here mean to imply any transvaluations of values, confusing good and evil, suggesting that good produces evil, or that there's no difference between good and evil, or good and ill-disposed persons. Nor is it suggested that the virtues of good people are not really virtues. Then there must be a grave error in the means by which they seek to attain their ends. There must even be an error in their primary axioms to permit them to continue using such means. Something is terribly wrong in the procedure. Somewhere. What is it? Certainly, the slaughter committed from time to time by barbarians invading settled regions or the capricious cruelties of avowed tyrants would not add up to 1/10 of the horrors perpetrated by rulers with good intentions. As the stories come down to us, the ancient Egyptians were enslaved by Pharaoh through a benevolent scheme of ever-normal granaries. Provision was made against famine, and then the people were forced to barter property and liberty for such reserves which they had previously been taken from their own production. The inhuman hardness of the ancient Spartans was practiced for a civic ideal of virtue. The early Christians were persecuted for reasons of the state, the collective welfare, and they resisted for the right of personality, for each had a soul of his own. Those killed by Nero for sport were few compared to those put to death by later emperors for strictly moral reasons. Gilles de Retz, who murdered children to gratify a beastly perversion, killed no more than 50 or 60 in all, and Cromwell ordered the massacre of 30,000 people at once, including infants in arms, in the name of righteousness. Even the brutalities of Peter the Great had the pretext of a design to benefit his subjects. The present war, World War II, begun with a perjured treaty made by two powerful nations, Russia and Germany, that they might crush smaller neighbors with impunity. The treaty being broken by a surprise attack on their fellow conspirator would have been impossible without the internal political power, which in both cases was seized on the excuse of doing good to the nation. The lies, the violence, the wholesale killings were practiced first on the people of both nations by their own respective governments. It may well be said, and may well be true, that in both cases the wielders of power are vicious hypocrites, that their conscience objective was evil from the beginning. Nonetheless, they could not have come to power at all, except with the consent and assistance of good people. The communist regime in Russia gained control by promising the peasants land in terms the promisers knew to be a lie as understood. Having gained power, the communists took from the peasants the land they already owned and exterminated those who resisted. That was done by plan and intention, and the lie was praised as social engineering by socialist admirers in America. If that is engineering, then the sale of fake mining stock is engineering. The whole population of Russia was put under duress and terror. Thousands were murdered without trial, and millions were worked to death and starved to death in captivity. Likewise, the whole population of Germany was put under duress and terror by the same means. With the war, Russians in German prison camps, Germans in Russian prison camps are enduring no worse and no other fate than their compatriots, as in great numbers have endured and are enduring from their own governments in their own countries. If there is any slight difference, they suffer rather less from the vengeance of avowed enemies than from the proclaimed benevolence of their compatriots. The conquered nations of Europe under Russian German heel are merely experiencing what Russians and Germans have been through the years under their own national regimes. Further, the principal political figures now wielding power in Europe, including those who have sold their countries to the invader, are socialists, ex-socialists, or communists, men whose creed was the collective good. With all this demonstrated to the hilt, we have the peculiar spectacle of the man who condemned millions of his own people to starvation, admired by philanthropists whose declared aim it is to see to it that everyone in the world has a quart of milk. A graduate professional charity worker has flown halfway around the world to seek an interview with this master of his trade and to write rhapsodies on being granted such a privilege. To keep themselves in office for the professed purpose of doing good, similar idealists welcome the political support of grafters, convicted pimps, and professional thugs. This affinity of these types invariably reveals itself when the occasion arises. But what is the occasion? Why did the humanitarian philosophy of 18th century Europe usher in the reign of terror? It did not happen by chance. It followed from the original premise, objective, and means proposed. The objective is to do good to others as a primary justification of existence. The means is the power of the collective, and the premise is that the good is collective. So that's her thesis. Statism has three wrong ideas. One is the premise, and the premise is that the objective to do good to others is the primary justification for our lives on earth. The second thing is the objective, and the objective is, that is the objective, is the means, is to do good to others. The means proposed is the power of the collective. That's of course, I would say the great error of illiberalism. That it took liberal ideas and sought to achieve them through illiberal means. So I got the means wrong. This is the analysis of Herbert Spencer of what happened to liberalism. And the third is the premise that there is no good outside the collective, that there's no individual good, that all good is essentially collective good. Back to Paterson. The root of the matter is ethical, philosophical, and religious, involving the relation of man to the universe, of man's creative faculty to his creator. The fatal divergence occurs in failing to recognize the norm of human life. Here echoes of Rand there, right? Obviously, there's a great deal of pain and distress incidental to existence. Poverty and illness and accident are possibilities, which may be reduced to a minimum, but cannot be altogether eliminated from the hazards mankind must encounter. But these are not desirable conditions to be brought about or perpetuated. Naturally, children have parents, while most adults are in fair health most of their lives and are engaged in useful activities which bring them a livelihood. That is the norm and the natural order. Ills are marginal. They can be alleviated from the marginal surplus of production. Otherwise, nothing at all could be done. Therefore, it cannot be supposed. Here we go again with some classic Randian analysis. Therefore, it cannot be supposed that the producer exists only for the sake of the non-producer, the well for the sake of the ill, the competent for the sake of the incompetent, nor any person merely for the sake of another. The logical procedure, if it is held that any person exists only for the sake of another, was carried out in semi-barbarous societies when the widow or followers of a dead man were buried alive in his grave. The great religions, and so, this very interestingly sort of Randian style analysis is immediately followed by praise of religious institutions. The great religions, which are also great intellectual systems, have always recognized the conditions of the natural order. They enjoin charity, benevolence, as moral obligation to be met out by the producer's surplus. That is, they make it secondary to production for the inescapable reason that without production there could be nothing to give. So you see how she's justifying religion? It's like, your purpose isn't to live for another. It's an obligation that follows your primary obligation, which is production. So benevolence comes after you make the wealth. Consequently, they prescribe the most severe rule to be embraced only voluntarily for those who wish to devote their lives wholly to works of charity from contributions. Always this is regarded as a special vocation, nuns, priests, whatever, because it could not be a general way of life. Since the almoner must obtain the funds or goods he distributes from the producers, he has no authority to command. He must ask. When he subtracts his only livelihood from such alms, he must take no more than bare subsistence. In proof of his vocation, he must even forego the happiness of family life, if he were to receive the formal religious sanction, in a religious order or whatever. Never was he to derive comfort for himself from the misery of others. So the religious orders maintained hospitals and reared orphans and distributed food. Part of such alms was given unconditionally, that there might be no compulsion under the cloak of charity. Isn't that interesting? So you see that the kind of humanitarianism she's condemning does not, she goes out of her way to claim that this is not the humanitarianism that you get from normal forms of religious charity and benevolence. It is not decent to make a man strip his soul in return for bread. This is the real difference when charity is enjoined in the name of God and not on humanitarian or philanthropic principles. If the sick were cured, the hungry fed, the orphans cared for until they grew up, it was certainly good, and the good cannot be computed in merely physical terms. But such actions were intended to tide the beneficiaries over for a period of distress and restore them to the norm if possible. If the distressed could partly help themselves, so much the better. If they could not, that fact was recognized. But most of the religious orders made a concurrent effort to be productive, that they might give of their own surplus, as well as distributing donations, which is true. I mean, medieval Europe, the religious orders had the first really expansive capitalistic orders after feudalism. It wasn't the factory systems that gave us the division of labor in factories and wages for workers and that sort of thing. It truly was monasteries and convents that were hiring people away from feudal plantations. That was truly the origin of capitalism we're talking about in the 14th and 15th centuries, essentially. When they performed productive work, such as building, teaching for a reasonable fee, farming or incidental industries and arts, the results were lasting, not only in their particular products, but in the enlargement of knowledge and advanced methods. So in the long run, they raised the norm of welfare. And it should be noted that these enduring results were derived from self-improvement. What can one human being actually do for another? Well, he can give him his own funds and his own time, whatever he can spare. But he cannot bestow faculties which nature has denied, nor give away his own subsistence without becoming dependent himself. Okay? If he earns what he gives away, he must earn it first, and surely he has a right to domestic life if he can support a wife and children. He must therefore reserve enough for himself and his family to continue production. No one person, through his income, be $10 million a year, can take care of every case of need in the world. But supposing he has no means of his own, and still imagines he can make helping others at once his primary purpose and the normal way of life, which is the central doctrine of the humanitarian creed, how is he to go about it? Well, neediest cases certified by secular charitable foundations which pay their own officers handsomely. The needy have been investigated but not relieved. Out of donations received, the officials pay themselves first. This is embarrassing even to the rhinoceros's height of the professional philanthropists. She hates them. But how is this confession to be evaded? If the philanthropist could command the means of the producer instead of asking for a portion, he could claim credit for production, being in a position to give orders to the producer. He can blame the producer for not carrying out orders to produce more. So you see, she's building a case for why this ethic, where to live for others is the primary justification of life, will inevitably lead to statism. Right? Because otherwise you destroy the whole basis for the production of wealth. If the primary objective of the philanthropist, whose justification for living is to help others, his ultimate good requires that others shall be in want. His happiness is the obverse of their misery. If he wishes to help humanity, the whole of humanity must be in need. The humanitarian wishes to be a prime mover in the lives of others. He cannot admit either the divine or natural order by which men have the power to help themselves. The humanitarian puts himself in the place of God. But he's confronted with two awkward facts. First, that the competent do not need his assistance, and secondly, that the majority of people, if unperverted, positively do not want to be done good by the humanitarian. When it's said that everyone should live primarily for others, what is the specific course to be pursued? Is each person to do exactly what any other person wants them to do without limits or reservations, and only what others want him to do? What if various persons make conflicting demands? The scheme is unpracticable. Perhaps then he is to do only what is good for others. But will those others know what is good for them? No, that is ruled out by the same difficulty. Then shall A do what he thinks is good for B, and B do what he thinks is good for A, or shall A accept only what he thinks is good for B, and vice versa? But that is absurd. Of course, what the humanitarian actually proposes is that he shall do what he thinks is good for everybody. And at this point, the humanitarian sets up the guillotine. Interesting. What kind of world does the humanitarian contemplate as affording him full scope? It could only be a world filled with bread lines and hospitals in which nobody retained the natural power of human being to help himself or resist having things done to him. And that is precisely the world that the humanitarian arranges when he gets his way. When a humanitarian wishes to see to it that everyone has a quart of milk, it is evident that he hasn't got the milk and cannot produce it for himself. Or why should he be merely wishing? Further, if he did not have a sufficient quantity of milk to bestow a quart on everyone, as long as his proposed beneficiaries can and do produce milk for themselves, they would say, no, thank you. Then how is the humanitarian to contrive that he shall have all the milk to distribute, and that everyone else shall be in want of milk? There's only one way, and that is by the use of political power in its fullest extension. Hence, the humanitarian feels the utmost gratification when he visits or hears of a country in which everyone is restricted to ration cards, where subsistence is doled out and the desideratum has been achieved of general want and a superior power to relieve it. The humanitarian, in theory, is the terrorist in action. The good people give him the power he demands because they have accepted his false premise. The advance of science lent it a specious plausibility with the increase in production. And since there is enough for everybody, why cannot the needy be provided for first? And the question thus disposed of permanently. Okay, I'll stop reading there. You can see that she's philosophically very rigorous and absolutely thrilling. a thinker, and very persuasive. The beautiful thing too about reading Isabel Paterson is that she gives you this beautiful sort of analysis that we tend to associate with Rand, that production has to come before consumption or charity, without the extremism, I would say, of Rand, of saying that egoism being the sort of exclusive ethical postulate of humanity. Patterson goes out of her way to extol charity and benevolence and care for others as not a primary justification for existence, but a secondary one that comes before production. I think that's a really interesting way to look at it. I think Patterson's chapter here is actually in some ways more defensible than what eventually emerges as Rand's own position, Atlas Shrugged, which is different and distinct. Atlas Shrugged comes out, what, 12 years later, something like that? You can see that it grew out in part of discussions with Isabel Paterson. Okay, you know, I do want to say a couple of words about whether or not she's right about her analysis, and I think it's absolutely true. I mean, the humanitarianism of the Enlightenment, and I actually love the word humanitarian. I think it's a very good term. It's one I think we should embrace as liberals, because true humanitarianism has to have the right means. The humanitarianism she describes was corrupted because it made living for others a primary justification for existence, and in order to be fulfilled, had to turn to statist means to make that possible. So it's the means, it's first of all the philosophical idea that living for others is a primary justification in life, and to fulfill that primary purpose, then post-Enlightenment or 20th century style humanitarianism turned to the means of the state as the only way to achieve their ideals, which fits very much with Herbert Spence's theory that the problem with the bad turn for liberalism was not a confusion over ideals. It was a confusion over the proper means to achieve those ideals. So I would say that probably Patterson would agree with him over that. So in my own language and my own thinking on here, I like the idea of recapturing a genuine humanitarianism, which in an Enlightenment sense really just means a kind of a benevolent attitude towards humanity and a constant wish to see all members of the human family thrive in a state of prosperity and peace. I mean, that to me is legitimate form of humanitarianism. So I don't want to demonize this word. Nonetheless, her analysis here is absolutely revealing, rich, and beautiful. Murray loved it. Murray Rothbard quoted this book and this sections of this chapter constantly in his own writings. Okay, I'm just about out of time, so I haven't checked the chat window in a while. We have an awkward situation now with these classes. First of all, as usual, I talked way too long. But under Spreecast, you could ask questions. Under this one, it's not possible to ask direct questions. Okay, I'm looking at the chat window. I don't see anything. So if you have anything, let me just wait a couple of seconds and you can go to the chat window. If you don't know where it is, you can find it at liberty.me under the live section. Thank you, Adam, for saying so. I always talk too long. I do this every time. I start these things and I think, well, this time I'm going to talk for like 15 minutes and we can just open up and talk to each other. But then I always end up taking up the entire hour because I get so excited about the book I'm discussing. Patterson is fascinating. You know, there's also a chapter in here on sound money and central banking. I'm always interested in people like this. I mean, she had a really good theory of the business cycle in this book in 1943, and a really good, strong advocacy of the gold standard. You know, sometimes I think we think that Mises brought all these ideas to American shores, and that he educated everybody about the importance of sound money. Well, that's, you know, evidently not true, because I mean, here you have this Mises got here in 1940. He hadn't written Human Action. I mean, Isabel Paterson has a beautiful chapter in here on money, and money and banking. That's just really excellent, and has the business cycle figured out, and everything. She's just absolutely marvelous. I do have to warn you, though. Every book of this time has the awkward moments in it. I mean, this is true of Discovery of Freedom with Rosewater Lane. I mean, like, the first half of that book I find to be one of the most brilliant things I've ever read in my life. The second half is, an awkward celebration of the glories of America, and particularly American foreign policy. And she's writing in 1943. Having experienced, known full well about World War I, about the Spanish-American War, about the U.S. government's war on the Native Americans. I mean, there was no excuse for her, unmitigated Americanism, except for the fact that maybe the book would not have been published because it was wartime and the censorship was on, right? So you have to always, kind of consider that point of view. But there's always something slightly embarrassing in these books that you wish you could change. And in Paterson's case, the embarrassing or the awkward thing about this book is this extended metaphor she uses about electricity and power sources and the human mind as being the fuel for the machine, which the machine being the wealth-creating machine. I mean, that's the kind of it's a sort of an interesting metaphor that you want to throw out there like once, but you don't really want to write a whole book around it. So, it does get a little awkward, a little bit tiresome pretty quickly. So you have to kind of look past that and get to the rest of it. Nonetheless, it's an absolutely brilliant book. Well, thank you, Terry, for suggesting 1.5 hours. It's very sweet. I appreciate that. Thank you for hanging around with me. I'm not sure what book we're going to be discussing next week. I always look forward to these. There are 25 books. I've selected each one of them. I love them all very deeply. And, for me personally, there's just something really wonderful about hanging around with friends and talking about these great intellectuals that have been forgotten. I mean, Isabel Paterson was just a brilliant intellectual, just a mighty figure, and a huge influence without whom many of us would not be here today. As I talked about in the opening here, ideas are capable of being remixed because they're infinitely malleable. Paterson exercised an enormous influence over so many people. Those ideas have come down to us, and that's the reason we're able to have a platform like liberty.me, and a big enough liberty community to support it. So in so many ways, she is our benefactor, and we ourselves have benefited from her struggles. She died in 1961, and it's so beautiful to me that she can continue to speak to us in the form of this very beautiful book. Well, thank you for hanging around with me tonight. And oh, that's funny, Dan, you were following along with the text. Thank you for hanging around with me tonight. I look forward to seeing you next week. And keep writing on liberty.me. Keep posting those status updates, and I look forward to bumping into this next week. All the best, my friends. Take care. Bye-bye. In 1943. A little bit strange. It came out the same year as The Fountainhead and Rosewater Lane's book, The Discovery of Freedom, and this book. So 3 women the same year published, very mighty tributes to human liberty at the same time, and they all reviewed each other's books favorably. Apparently, Paterson didn't really like Lane and didn't really review her book favorably. We should never forget that in the course of intellectual history, personal disputes have a lot to do with what people say. It's very common that somebody would be deeply influenced by somebody else and yet never cite them or mention their names in public. I mean, I had this happen to me, actually. It's very interesting. I've had good friends who I sort of mentored to maturity, you know, and then moved on to a different career, and for whatever kind of political reasons are unwilling to acknowledge my existence. Actually, it's pretty weird and kind of freaky. I don't like to be that way. I like to talk about, you know, I like to believe that I'm fair and that sort of thing, but you know, whatever. I mean, in the course of intellectual history, it's very common for mentors and proteges to never mention each other's existence. And that was true with Paterson vis-a-vis Rosewater Lane. Lane loved this book. Thank you, Emily. Emily's commenting on my jacket. So yeah, well, it is what it is. So I sometimes wear it, you know, I mean, this is not a jacket that I would wear to the office. But it is Sunday after all. So that's a day for knocking around and being a little bit silly. So I threw it on because it's comfortable and kind of crazy. So there you go. Used to be, you know, probably in the 1920s, very fashionable, you know, sort of colonial madras patchwork wear. Now, of course, you hardly see it at all anymore because it's for obvious reasons. It's totally absurd. So, but it is what it is. So thank you. Well, listen, I'm so glad to be with you tonight. We're going to be discussing Isabel Paterson's amazing book, which I don't think many people have read. In fact, I don't think people are reading it at all. It emerges every once in a while in the course of conversation. People talk about her chapter, The Humanitarian with the Guillotine, which is chapter 20, which I'm going to focus on tonight. I think it is the best chapter, but I don't want to neglect the rest of the book. We have to remember something about this book. And just to give a little bit of background about Isabel Paterson and the book in general. This book, The God and the Machine, came out and praised it and reviewed it favorably. Ayn Rand praised this book, reviewed it very favorably. In fact, called it, you know, the best book on human liberty in many decades, maybe ever. Even praising it above her own work. And Albert J. Nock highlighted this book as being, you know, an important and mighty treatise. But Paterson herself never acknowledged Lane's existence, although she would quite frequently write about Ayn Rand. So, you know, these kind of relationships are complicated. We should never forget this one in the course of trying to discover intellectual history. Personal relationships matter as much as the ideas. You have to know something about the characters and something about the biographies to fully understand this. But I think this is a mistake that intellectual historians often make, is if such and such thinker is not citing somebody else, you figure, well, there's no influence there. It's just ridiculously untrue. For example, I mean, just to mention one example, I was very good friends with Murray Rothbard in the 10 years before his death. And he always praised Ayn Rand, you know, as a great thinker and a great figure in history. But you wouldn't quite know that from his writings, because he had something like a very long relationship with the collective, into Rand's collective, entered into the collective, left, re-entered it, left again. He was hugely influenced by Ayn Rand. In many ways, I would say that Rothbard is predominantly a student of Rand's, but you would not know that by reading his works, because the personal, because the complications of the personal relationship were so intense. You know, his best friend, George Reisman, and he had a dispute over when, you know, over the Rand mess. And Murray went one way, Reisman went the other way. They never spoke again in the course of their lives. You know, things like this happen. Personal relationships end up being hugely important. And for Isabel Paterson, her relationship with Rand was itself gigantically important in her life. And Rand's, in turn, owes a great debt to Isabel Paterson. You know, how this allocates itself out, I'm not entirely sure. probably at this point last year, I would have thought that Rand's ideas about humanitarianism and the ethic of egoism had come from Patterson, because in the chapter I'm going to read to you, I mean, Patterson sounds a lot like Rand. There's some differences, but the language is so similar, and that to the language you read like in Atlas Shrugged. But now that I've read a little more Rand and been embedded a little bit, like, okay, this is great. I guess we're live. I don't know. Just give me a couple of seconds to check on this. Okay, good. There's a 30-second delay on liberty.me. That's fine. Good. Okay, I guess I'm seeing some chatters. It's hard to tell from this. This is our new system of using Google Hangouts for live presentations, which I actually far prefer. So if you can hear me okay, just type in the window. That's fine.